part of the talk, weaving primary documents in secondary historical accounts into fiction. Now, when I discovered Mary Vassar, I was finishing my PhD in African American literature, but to take on this project, I still had to do a whole lot of new research that I had never done before, because I really needed to learn about the world that this woman would have lived in order to create the story of her life in that world. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples about that. And one is, of course, what it meant to live in Richmond, Virginia. Now, Richmond is not a plantation, it's not rural. It is urban, it's a state capital, it will later become the capital of the Confederacy. It is what I like to call the north of the South, if you think about where it is. So it's got stronger ties in some ways just to northern states than to other southern states. And it is an industrialized city, despite the simplified history that some of us may have heard. There are factories there, there's ironworks, there are tobacco factories, and there are skilled laborers. And a lot of those skilled laborers are slaves. So many of the slaves in Richmond are hired out. I wait for the button.
Mm-hmm. I'll watch it.
Are hired out slaves. And that means that they are owned. So think about the settlement of Virginia. The coast gets settled first in the 17th century. There are plantations there. That land gets worked and worked, and the people who own slaves have increasing slave populations from one generation to the next. So now we're flashing forward to the middle of the 19th century. The land is fairly overworked, and there are people who have more slaves than they have land to work with those slaves. So they rent out their slaves to people in other parts of the state. A lot of those slaves are skilled laborers because that's what you need to have when you're in Richmond. You have a blacksmith shop, you have an ironworks, you have a factory. You need some skilled laborers. One of the things that is astonishing is that often the slaves themselves would negotiate their hire. So on January 1st, there would be this frenzy in the streets of Richmond, and people would be negotiating what they were going to do for the next year. They were year-long contracts that the slaves would then, because their owners were living far away, often negotiate where they would be living, who they would be paying their room and board to, and they would have less direct supervision than slaves usually did as they moved about the city. It's also always true that the laws are only observed in as much as they are convenient for people with power. You've probably encountered this in life in general. In terms of the hired out slaves, what that meant was if I owned a business where it was useful for me to have people who worked for me be literate, whether that was word literacy or numeric literacy, the ability to keep accounts, then I would teach those people, or I would look for people who had those skills. So even though it was illegal for slaves to be taught literacy, some slaves might still have it or achieve it in some way. So we have on the one hand this, we have on the one hand the hired out slaves in Richmond. We also have, and most of those hired out slaves are male. There are some women, and they would often hire their time and work as seamstresses or as domestic laborers and then pay the people who own them a certain share, and they would use the rest to pay for their living arrangements.
You're back.
Thanks. Also in the Black community in Richmond were free blacks. Nearly 1 out of every 5 African Americans in the city was free. And there was a lot of interaction between the slave and the free population. And free blacks would be more likely to perhaps own their own businesses, maybe own their own houses, and to be literate. Though that wasn't necessarily true for everybody, much more opportunity. You would have families in which some members were slave and some were free. There were a number of black churches. This is a picture of First African Baptist Church, which in the mid-1800s had 3,000 members. Now, like 3,000 members is a mega church today, right? So imagine that period of time, and those members are both free and slave. So this is a place where the black community is coming together every week. The minister of First African Baptist Church was appointed by First Baptist Church, which was the sponsoring church of this church, a white church. That man is a slave owner, so he's the minister to this congregation, but he also, for example, writes a treatise to teach blacks, slave or free, how to read, because he thinks the most important thing you can do is read the Bible. So he is out there ready to break Virginia law to do the thing that he thinks is right, but also has no problem owning slaves. And this is the wonderful thing about race in America, right? It is never cut and dried and never very clear, and a lot of I say one thing and I do another because we are often all rationalizing our choices. So we have this slave community that is having a really different experience than slaves on plantations who were much more isolated would. And yet, at the same time, Richmond is one of the slave trading capitals of the United States. In 1860, they did, I'm trying to remember the number offhand, $4 million worth of business just in selling slaves in the city of Richmond. That's $1860. So they're second only to New Orleans as a slave trading capital. So black person, free or slave, walking through that city, you would see public whipping posts, you would see auction houses, you would see slave pens. So you are negotiating your life around this reality. And those of you may recognize this guy, or this illustration of this guy. That's Henry Box Brown. Anybody have heard of Henry Box Brown?
Yes. He shipped himself in box and made it.
Yeah, so Henry Box Brown was a hired out slave working in Richmond, Virginia. He came home one day and he rented a house. His wife rented her time from her owner, and they had children. And he came home one day to his house, and he saw his wife and children being led away in chains because they were being sold. Her owner had decided to sell his family, and there was nothing that he could do. And that was when he decided he could not take this anymore, and he shipped himself to freedom. And so Henry Box Brown is a character or a figure who I think shows up sometimes in history books. And I bring him up just to say that even with the relative freedom that slaves had if they were hired out in Richmond, ultimately to be owned by somebody else was to be completely subject to them, even if your material conditions weren't as bad as the material conditions of some slaves. So this is all very interesting. How do I make that part of the story that I want to create around Mary Bowser? Well, I get to invent a lot of things. So I invent her family. In my invented world, her mother is a slave, and she's a slave to the Van Loon family. They're domestic laborers. There are other slaves in the Van Loon house. So there's a cook named Zinni, a coachman named Josiah. They have daughters who are also slaves. There's also a butler in the house, all slaves. In my invented universe, Mary Bowser's father is one of those skilled laborers. He's a blacksmith, originally born in Eastern Virginia, rented out to a blacksmith in Richmond, and then bought by that blacksmith. So he lives not with his family. He lives in a cabin that he shares with a free black couple. And he only sees his family once a week on Sundays, and then they go to prayer meeting. So